Next item on the agenda deals with LGA, local government aid, and CPA distribution issue that Representative Drazkowski raised on our first day of session, our first meeting. Now that we're past the February forecast, I've asked the Department of Revenue to explain what happened before the committee. I see we have our testifier. Welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record, and if you could walk us through the issue, and then we can take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Andrea Fish. I'm here today on behalf of the Property Tax Division of the Department of Revenue, as Chair Carlson mentioned, to talk about recertification for local government and county program aids that are payable this year. As you may know, we recertified these aids in February to ensure that all cities and counties receive the correct amount of aids under statute. We recertified these aids after discovering an error in our calculation of adjusted net tax capacities, or ANTCs, that are one of the components used for both LGA and CPA amounts. Now, the issue is isolated to 3 separate provisions in session law that require TIF districts in Minneapolis, South St. Paul, and St. Paul to be added back into those cities' tax bases for purposes of adjusted net tax capacities. Except for those 3 TIF districts and those 3 session laws, normally TIF districts are left out of those calculations. The result of not including those TIF districts in that ANTC calculation was that Minneapolis, St. Paul, and South St. Paul, as well as their counties of Hennepin, Dakota, and Ramsey, were all certified to receive a little more aid than they should have been. And because these are set appropriation amounts that are distributed between all of the cities and counties that receive them, it meant that other cities and counties were certified to receive less aid than they should have been. So on February 7th, corrected aid amounts were certified and communicated to all cities and counties. Under the distribution of the formula, 678 cities were certified to receive increased aid amounts ranging from $2 up to just over $36,000. 52 counties were also certified to receive increased aid amounts that ranged from around $1,100 to just over $33,000. Now, for aids payable in 2020, the cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, South St. Paul, as well as their counties, will receive the amounts of aid that they were initially certified to receive in our effort to hold both those jurisdictions and their taxpayers harmless for this error. Going forward, however, their newly recertified amounts will be their base amounts for calculating these aids. At the Department of Revenue, we hold ourselves to very high standards of accuracy and excellence, and we apologize for this error. We were very grateful that we could take swift action to ensure that all cities and counties receive the correct amount of aid under law. And based on our review, we're confident that this issue has been resolved for this year and going forward. We're here today to address any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Fish, and I do appreciate you and your colleagues taking the time to meet with me personally to explain the issue and how the department has addressed it. So I appreciate that. Members, questions? Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Fish, do you have any handouts today or to show us the numbers or no?
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, I don't. I have some numbers available with me in my notes.
Okay.
That can help.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you. And Ms. Fish, so what I understand happened, and listening to you say it again, is that there were some counties that originally were certified a lower amount than they should have been finally, right? And so we're going to use the final one and correct them so they come up to the level they're supposed to be at. Additionally, there were some counties that initially were promised a higher amount according to the certification, but when then they were supposed to get finally. And so what the Revenue Department is doing and what is in the forecast is to also pay those that were mistakenly given a higher certification than they should have been and give them that higher amount even though they're really supposed to get a smaller amount. And apparently, and I did look, you have a place in statute that gives you the authority to do that, which I think is terrible policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay those counties the higher amount, even though that's not the amounts they're supposed to get, under the belief that we want to do that because they're into the budgeting process or they're going to be, and we don't want to mess up their figures. Is that the right capture on this one, Ms. Fish?
Ms. Fish.
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, to probably repeat what you said, make sure we're on the same page, and I think we are. When we certified the amounts last year, those were used for budget purposes, as you discussed. So to hold those jurisdictions harmless, we are paying them the amount they were certified to receive. We did recertify for all of the other counties regardless, because we need to make them whole in accordance with statute. So 3 counties will receive more aid than they should have been certified to receive. They will receive exactly what they were certified to receive.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ms. Fish. That's how I understand it too. So we're actually treating 3 counties better than the rest of the counties in regarding what they should get according to the formula. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and Representative Drazkowski, just to be clear, this will be corrected in the year 2021. So it's been identified and will be addressed next year.
But, Mr. Chair, it's a one-time inequity that
Understood.
that we're providing for those 3 counties simply because there was a short-term mistake made.
Understood. Just wanted to provide that clarification. Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Fish, you probably have some of those numbers. I had a visit from somebody from Department of Revenue about this. It was around 1.2 million, I think is the number that we're talking about, that the department intends to distribute additional funds. And I think that, I recall roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of that was in 4 entities. Most of it went to where some of the shortfall was. Could you just revisit some of those numbers? You probably have those available, so everybody understands.
So, Ms. Fish, I also, in conversation with Ms. Schill, may have some numbers to share too, if you want to, Andrew, if you would like to try that, just know that there is additional help if necessary.
Certainly. Mr. Chair, Representative Hertaus, I believe you were asking about where the amounts were of that approximately 1.2 million. The city of Minneapolis, the difference was 834,000, St. Paul about 67,000, South St. Paul just under 54,000, and that was for LGA. So the total LGA local government aid recertification amount was a little over $955,000.
Representative Hertaus?
Could you repeat the second one again?
Mr. Chair, Representative Hertaus, for the city of St. Paul, was a little over $67,000.
And those were underpayments or overpayments?
Overpayments. Overpayments.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Petersburg, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Fish, too. I'm going to follow up a little bit on Representative Drazkowski's question. Now, I understand that these 3 counties that were over-certified and got the higher payment, and that the certification will be corrected next year, but I didn't hear anything to clarify whether or not they're going to be able to keep this one-time windfall, or if it's going to be subtracted from next year's actual payment in order to equalize that certification. I think that's the concern that I was questioning.
Representative Petersburg, yes, they will be able to keep the funds, but Ms. Fish, if you would like to expand.
Mr. Chair, Representative, that is correct. We don't have a precedence of demanding a payback in these scenarios. So as of today, the 2020 aid will be the amount they were certified to receive. Their 2021 aid will be recertified later this year based on updated data.
Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree with Representative Drazkowski. That seems like a poor precedent because in private practice and others, if we get more than we're at, government's going to ask it back from us. So it's just something that I think is fair, and I don't mind the fact that it's under budgeting and we have to deal with it, but then they should be expecting to get less next year in order to be able to budget for that as well. It just seems like a precedent that's realistic.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Fish, just question, curious if the counties noticed this extra payment, and if so, did they contact the department stating that, hey, we got some extra money here? Or was it the department that realized the extra payment, the overpayment?
Ms. Fish.
Mr. Chair, Representative McDonald, we were not notified by any of the cities or counties. This was something that we noticed when we were analyzing these aids for forecast purposes.
Representative
And a
McDonald?
follow-up, would the counties, the auditor, would have they noticed it? Would that be custom? I would imagine if you had $67,000 coming in more than your certified LGA, do you think that's something that they would have caught? Or do you think it was just missed by those who would see those numbers within the county?
Ms. Fish?
Chair Carlson, Representative McDonald, I can't comment on necessarily whether they would have noticed that or not. No one had mentioned it when we contacted them directly.
Representative Drazkowski?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I appreciate the conversation. Mr. Chair and members, I did get a bill drafted that does exactly what Representative Petersburg's thinking about, and that is if policy is and state law allows the department to make that larger payment that is bigger than what they're supposed to get, let's instead change policy. It says, you know what, city or county X, you were paid too much this time. A year from now, your LGA or CPA is going to be reduced by that same amount. You can take the extra money and put it in the bank and hold on to it for a year from now or whatever. But I'd ask Mr. Chair for a hearing on the bill and indulgence by the committee when we get to that point. Thank you.
We shall see. Representative Herr?
Chair, and I just wanted to talk about, not that I want to minimize the issues of this error or this oversight, but I want to keep perspective that this error of under $1 million was 0.19% of the overall amount of LGA, and that it is really, though, I'm like I said, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of when a city gets overpaid, but if, just to say thank you to the groups that actually calculate and do this work, I think that I have actually sat with my own city and looked at their LGA calculation. It is very difficult, and for like a city of St. Paul, they're getting $65,000 extra is not a windfall of money. We actually have one of the greatest needs in our city. And so I do appreciate that this area is getting looked at, but for us to have perspective that this is a fraction of a percentage of what we are looking at. And so I appreciate the work that's being put into place to correct this and to keep perspective as to what we're actually looking at here and the cost it takes us to actually create more rules that we put into place to correct a 0.1% error, which when I worked in the corporate sector was called a rounding error.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Follow-up comments, Representative Hertaus?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the department being straightforward and honest in admitting that the mistake was made and that you intended to deal with it, not necessarily the way some of us think it should be. But to Representative Herr's point, I guess, yes, it's a small amount of money, but it's still taxpayer money. And this really flies right in the face of more than 12% of all of the cities in Minnesota that are off a formula with LGA and get nothing. So when they hear about the fact that cities were overpaid substantial sums of money and they get nothing, it really generates a lot of concern with regard to having LGA being distributed in an equitable and a fair manner. All of these communities that are off formula absolutely contribute to the general fund, not only in the form of sales taxes and income taxes by their constituents, but also with fiscal disparities and other sources of revenue to the general fund. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Hertaus. Further comment? Seeing none? All right, Ms. Fish, would you like to make a closing comment?
Mr. Chair, I will just reiterate that we also hold ourselves to very high standards of accuracy, and we certainly will work with any members on questions they have, follow-up, and the usual. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Fish. We appreciate your testimony and you being here today.